Dr. Christopher Irwin is actually one of our own, earned a doctorate here in economics at the University of New Mexico. And I had the distinct honor and pleasure of working with Dr. Irwin when he was a graduate student, and we actually co-authored a study that was attached to the meeting invite that was published in the Race, Ethnicity, and Education Journal in 2018 on QuantCrit, critical race theory and quantitative methods. And our study, which he'll go into along with additional iterations of that study, we're really interested in understanding why it's not enough to look at graduation by race alone, gender alone, or class alone, or first generation college status alone. And Dr. Christopher Irwin is now a postdoctoral fellow at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. So this is why it's pitch dark right now, where Dr. Irwin is reciting. And his talk is going to be quantitative intersectionality and student success at HSIs, 2 examples using administrative data. And I can't underscore how important it is to use administrative data, because this is the entire population of students. It's not a survey, which is important. Surveys are important and they can get at information that is not otherwise available in administrative data, but it's not a replacement. So I think that this is a very, very unique data set. And I should mention that special issue that we published our article in Race, Ethnicity, and Education is actually forthcoming as a book on QuantCrit and anti-racist methodologies in education research that will be published by Routledge this summer. So if you want more information about that, that's forthcoming. But the intent there is to make that special issue available, especially to libraries that may not have a subscription, right, to a journal, but can't afford to buy a book to add to their collection and resources. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Christopher Irwin, who is going to again remind us what time it is in New Zealand.
Thank you, Nancy, and it's lovely to see everyone at the meeting here today. My name is Christopher Irwin. As Nancy said, I'm at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, which is why it's pitch black outside, but it's actually not too bad. It's 6:12 a.m. in the morning, which is not outside of my normal working hours. You'd be surprised, I've had some meetings at 2 and 3 in the morning, so this really isn't too bad for me. But with that said, I'll get things rolling. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so as Nancy had mentioned, the talk that I'm giving today is based on some of our joint work together while I was a PhD student at the University of New Mexico, and we've also continued that research since I've moved abroad. But the talk that I'll be giving today is Quantitative Intersectionality and Student Success at HSIs, 2 examples using administrative data. So just for a little bit of background, back in 2017, when I was a doctoral student at UNM, Nancy took the lead in assembling a team of 2 economists and 2 sociologists to contribute to this special issue on intersectionality in race, ethnicity, and education. Really, the overarching goal, or at least for me, was to try to make progress on developing some sort of flexible quantitative approach, which could harness the tenets of both intersectionality and critical race theory. Unbeknownst to me at the time, it was actually a pretty successful article, and we got quite a bit of citations from reputable outlets, including Nature, PLOS One, AERJ, the Journal of Hispanic Higher Education, and so on. And we kept this research rolling, and as we apply the methods to different contexts and different data sets, we're able to expand on the methods a little bit, which is really encouraging. So I'll be talking about the article that we've discussed that was published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, and I'll also talk about a current working paper that we have which is, again, looking at HSIs, but we have a focus on first generation status at universities. But this work jointly, it really highlights the flexibility in tweaking the model just based on the data set that you're given and the context that you're working within. For example, in our latest, our 2023 working paper, we're looking at, we pool administrative data from multiple institutions. And so we're trying to control for unobserved heterogeneity, i.e. things that are idiosyncratic to the particular university, and remove them from the analysis, so that we're really comparing apples to apples. As we know, university environments and cultures can be quite different, even when the universities are close to one another. And also this work together, it highlights the value in that it can be applied to across various disciplines and can be used in different contexts. So just a quick outline of today's talk. In part one, where I'll spend the most time, I'm just going to talk about how we developed this regression-based approach to intersectionality, sort of its pros, its cons, its weaknesses, how we've envisioned it, and where there's room to grow. In part two, I'll look at how those methods are used in our race, ethnicity, and education paper from 2018. And then in part three, I'll talk about our current working paper. And in part four, I'll briefly just discuss future research, which of course is going to touch on collaboration and data sharing of administrative data across HSIs. So before I dive in, I want to preface this talk with the fact that, as I'd mentioned, I'm an economist by trade. I was roped into this by Nancy. So my specialty and what I'll be speaking to in this talk is mostly methodology and how to take some of the features of intersectionality and critical race theory and how we've tried to turn that into some sort of statistical or econometric approach. I may be preaching to the choir, but here, when we're talking about intersectionality, we're just referring to the idea that people experience discrimination differently, just depending on the different roles that they play. There are different overlapping individual characteristics. For example, as was put so well in Crenshaw's 1989 work, that a Black woman is neither singularly Black nor singularly a woman, but experiences discrimination based on the interaction of both of these characteristics. And so her experience with discrimination is likely to differ from that of a white woman or a Black man, for example. And our approach is really an attempt to operationalize this type of thinking in terms of statistical models. And many of us are familiar with regressions that try to measure discrimination or account for race or ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status on the right-hand side or as the control variables. The problem with many of these approaches is that they treat individual characteristics as independent rather than interdependent. And if there's nothing else that you might glean from my presentation today, is that developing quantitative methods, regression-based methods that step away from treating race, ethnicity as singular issues and not considering the other interacting roles that people step into in their lived experiences, that would be a big improvement in terms of intersectional studies. So really just looking at interdependence rather than independence is something I'm going to be hammering today in my talk. So here I just want to walk through a sort of basic idea of how one might start to think about intersectionality using sort of a more traditional, old school, if you will, what I've called a naive approach. And then we'll build on that and we'll get to the model that Nancy and I have proposed, which is a little bit more comprehensive and fits the tenets of intersectionality and critical race theory a lot better. So let's just suppose, for our purposes today, that we wish to measure the likelihood that an individual is categorized as being low skill according to their indigenous status, their socioeconomic status, and their gender. Now, I didn't just grab this framework out of nowhere. This is actually from a working paper in New Zealand where we use OECD data. We use specifically the PIAAC survey of adult skills, and we do this very thing. And so what I'm calling a naive approach, a naive regression may take the form here where the likelihood of being designated as being low skill is just a linear function of binary indicator variables, one that's equal to 1 if the respondent identifies as female and 0 otherwise, 1 if the respondent identifies as indigenous and 0 otherwise, and 1 if the respondent falls in the lowest income quartile and 0 otherwise. And I'll just mention with this particular data set, the OECD administers this PIAAC survey, and they have different modules, one for literacy, one for numeracy, one for problem solving in technology-rich environments. And given the responses, then they provide a numeric skill. And so low skill to them is just based off a numerical cutoff, but in our case, the outcome is just a binary 1, 0. So given this naive regression, it's important to remember, and I'm going to use some economist lingo on you, that coefficients have a ceteris paribus interpretation, right? So when we're looking at the coefficient, say alpha 1, the coefficient on the female dummy variable, we're holding everything else constant. So alpha 1 measures the effect of being a woman on the likelihood of being classified as low skill by the OECD, holding everything else constant. So in other words, we're treating here gender, indigeneity, and SES as important factors, which is why they end up on the right-hand side, but we're treating them as independent from one another in a sense, in the way that we're modeling this regression. Another way of thinking about regressions like this, we're beholden to the administrative data. So here we only have 2 genders and we have 2 indigenous status. That would be indigenous statuses, excuse me. So either the person identifies as indigenous or they do not. And then we have a low income, non-low income group. So if we multiply this 2 by 2 by 2, that gives us 8 social locations that we're interested in. And overall, we're interested in how these 8 specific social locations fare in terms of the likelihood of them being classified as low skill. So one thing that we can do with regressions is we can just take linear combinations or just add the appropriate coefficients to get at the predicted likelihood of being classified as low skill for each of these 8 social locations. And so that's what I've done here at near the bottom of the slide. So as you can see, just to pick one out at random, high income indigenous women. So you're going to be adding the intercept plus the coefficient on female plus the coefficient on indigenous to get to the overall likelihood of being classified as low skill. And the way I like to think about these sorts of regressions is that we're sort of turning off or turning on different variables depending on which group we're looking at. So if you noticed, high income non-indigenous men, right? The first group that I have listed there. So if we want to see their predicted likelihood, right, we know that the female dummy variable is going to be turned off because this is a high income non-indigenous man. Likewise, the low income variable will be turned off and the indigenous variable will be turned off. And so we measure the likelihood, the predicted probability of being classified as low skill just by that intercept term, alpha naught or alpha 0. So the problem with this ceteris paribus interpretation is that, well, it's akin to what Crenshaw's critique of what she calls conceptual limitations of single issue analyses. And, for essentially in so many words, this is exactly what I'm citing as being problematic in the regression approach, is taking things like gender, race, ethnicity, indigeneity, whatever it be, and treating them as important sources of discrimination for the individual's lived experience, but not recognizing that these aren't single issues by themselves. They do not stand alone, and in fact, they depend on one another. So for example, in our naive example, and the equation is still up on the slide, a Maori woman living in poverty in New Zealand may face discrimination through 3 separate avenues, right? The model allows for discrimination through being indigenous, through being low income, and being a woman. However, these effects are assumed to be independent, right? We're just adding them up. They're not actually interacting with one another, which I believe is a more appropriate approach. So yes, they're being additive rather than being interdependent, where we might have some multiplicative interaction terms that would show up in the equation. So our proposed solution to such conceptual limitations, to use that phrase, is to assume interdependency of individual characteristics. So multiplicative rather than these additive and separate effects. So a more realistic model, given the fact that we are our sole interest or our primary interest here is in intersectionality, is to have an equation like one pictured on the slide, where we have our main effects, right? Our standalone effects of female, indigenous, and low income, but then we include interactions of these, right? So we have separate effects that are available for being both a woman and identifying as indigenous, or separate effects of being indigenous and low income simultaneously. And finally, beta 7, this is allowing, again, a completely separate source of discrimination for identifying simultaneously as female, as indigenous, and as low income, all at the same time. Now, just there are some terms that I want to throw out here, and because this is a relatively new approach in quantitative intersectionality, I'm putting them in quotes. We've called this a saturated model, just by the fact that it includes both those level effects or main effects like female, indigenous, low income, and all possible interaction effects in the model. So this model allows for additional sources of discrimination that stem from jointly belonging to multiple groups. And I've kind of thrown this term around, is that you might want to call these the overlap effects, right? It's those effects, those sources of discrimination that are above and beyond those independent main factors, such as your gender, your indigeneity in this case, or your socioeconomic status. It's the additional discrimination that's possible through the interaction of these individual characteristics. So as before, even though we have more terms on the right-hand side, we can still take the appropriate linear combinations of coefficients to arrive at predicted likelihoods for each of the social locations. And so this is just done exactly as we did with the naive model. However, we have more terms here, so we have more coefficients to add. So just a minor technical point, we can add these coefficients, but then coming up with the standard error to assess statistical significance it can be a bit complicated. Any statistical software package will do this for you using the delta method, which we use. And so really what this model becomes is sort of a two-step approach to investigating the sources of discrimination in various contexts. In the first one, we estimate this model that you see here on the slide, this more realistic model. We might transform our coefficients into odds ratios or marginal effects, just depending on the form of the regression that we're using. But what we do is we estimate this equation as is, as you see here on the slide, and then we look at the effect, size, significance, and sign, essentially the magnitude and the significance of these effects. And that gives us one look at intersectionality. However, if I'm just looking at a slew of estimated coefficients, it's hard for me to compare, say, how a low-income Indigenous woman is faring compared to a male Indigenous high-income individual, right? There's a lot of mental gymnastics that have to happen. Me looking at these various coefficients and adding them in my head and assessing, well, is that statistically significant? So step 2 of the model just does that for you. So step 1, we look at those raw coefficients. Step 2, we take the linear combinations of the appropriate coefficients, and then we look at each social location and see how they stack up compared to some arbitrary reference group that we designate. So both of these components, component 1 and component 2, they're both important to getting a holistic picture of the landscape of discrimination in various contexts. So the coefficients on the main and interaction effects tell us which sources of discrimination are driving the predicted likelihoods for each social location. And if we look at the second step, where we're actually comparing these predicted likelihoods for each of the social locations, it makes comparison easy, and it reveals some often unseen and sometimes very nuanced expressions of discrimination, landscapes of discrimination. They're often unseen when we take that naive approach of just assuming that individual level characteristics are independent. So some challenges that we've encountered so far: small cell sizes and empty cells. So this is a challenge in both the US data that I've worked with and in the New Zealand context. Some social locations just include very few subjects. For example, in the New Zealand working example that I've been talking about, high income Indigenous women are unfortunately a very small cell in the New Zealand data that we have. And so it's not to say that we can't do hypothesis testing, but we just need to recognize that there are certain limitations, especially when you want to do this dynamic centering and you want to look at each specific social location. However, some of them just populate as being empty. It can be a bit frustrating, but it's something to think of when we're operationalizing these investigations using regression. Also, there might not be any variation in outcomes for some cells, right? Say if we're looking at the likelihood of graduating within 6 or 8 years at a university, some social locations where the cell sizes are relatively small may be perfect predictors of success or failure, right? If say you're looking at high income white women, for example, in higher education, which is a social location which generally fares relatively well compared to other social locations. In some extreme examples, you might have the phenomenon that everyone in that social group graduates within that time frame, for example. And then the model starts to break down. Things aren't estimable because there's not enough variation in the data. Again, it's just something to keep in mind if these sorts of approaches are something that you're interested in. Also, the more dimensions that we add to this intersectional picture, the right-hand side terms add up very fast. It eats your degrees of freedom very quickly. So just as an example here, say we wanted to look at the likelihood of graduating from university within some certain time frame, that being a function of your first generation status, whether or not you are classified as low income, your gender, whether or not you identify as Hispanic, and then whether or not you're one of 5 races. For example, in our case, it would be white, Black, American, Indian, Asian, and some catch-all category like other. Now, if that was the setup, then you'd have 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 5, you would have 80 social locations. Not only is that a lot to report out to your audience, but really doing comparisons between social location number 67 and social location number 5, it might get a little bit too specialized and could risk the likelihood of being perhaps a bit mundane, or I think we may lose focus of the big picture if there's too many social locations to compare. So again, just something to consider if these methods are of interest to you. So extending the model is relatively easy. As I mentioned, say we were looking at pooled data across multiple universities, we can include university fixed effects in these models to remove any unobserved differences across universities that don't change over time, whether it be the relative size of their budget to one another, or student to faculty ratios are relatively stable in good times at universities. So adding fixed effects, controlling for cohort effects, institution effects, geographic effects, it's possible in these types of regressions, which can actually be quite powerful. Also, just having these models include some sort of hierarchical component is also something that can be quite powerful as well. This is something that we would do when we have subjects that are naturally clustered in groups. For example, with the two papers that I'm going to start talking about here in just a slide or two, in our race, ethnicity, education paper in 2018, we looked at students being naturally clustered in feeder high schools. And we wanted to see whether or not feeder high schools had a statistically significant impact on these different higher ed outcomes, which I'll get to momentarily. And in the New Zealand example that I cited, we have subjects that are naturally clustered within, which is akin to states in New Zealand. We call them territorial authorities. So essentially, this is just like including state fixed effects in the regression as well. So this is just a couple of extensions. This sort of approach is very young, and so there's a lot of room to develop these models and incorporate more complexities as we move forward. Okay, so that brings us to part 2 of my talk. So we'll talk about Nancy and I's joint work in race, ethnicity, and education. The title of this paper, if you're interested in reading it, and I believe we'll be distributing these papers if they haven't already been distributed. The paper is called Making the Invisible Visible, Advancing Quantitative Methods in Higher Education Using Critical Race Theory and Intersectionality. So the data that we used for this study was administrative, and it was from a medium-sized R1 HSI in the American Southwest. Outcomes that we were interested in were whether or not the student graduated within 6 years of matriculation, and whether or not they were placed in remedial English or remedial mathematics courses. The methods are just what I talked about over the previous slides. And, to give it this fancy name, because it doesn't really have a good catchy name yet, we've just been referring to it as saturated mixed effects logistic models, which is a mouthful, I'm aware. The main research questions, and these are actually similar across the two papers that I'm going to be briefly presenting. Number 1, what patterns of educational inequalities remain invisible when we treat race, gender, and class as independent? How do estimated achievement gaps change when we recognize that such characteristics are in fact dependent on one another or interdependent? And how is the simultaneity of structural racism, settler colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism experienced differently by students according to their location in intersecting systems of power, privilege, oppression, and resistance in a given context? So I'll just go into our table. So here I'll present the descriptives, and then I'll kind of do step 1 of our regression model and step 2, and then we'll sort of talk about the main takeaways. So here we've got descriptives for 2 samples, right? In the 2000 to 2008 samples, we're going to be using these data to analyze the likelihood of graduating within 6 years. Now, in the second column, the 2000 to 2015 column, we're actually going to be using these data to look at remedial class placement. Many within this 2000 and 2015, they haven't had ample time to graduate within 6 years, which is why that rate is not reported for that group. So this is really just a fancy way. This is how we put the model when it showed up in the journal article. So essentially, this is just an outcome for student I coming from high school J. And in our case, let's just say that it's the 6-year, whether or not they graduated from university within 6 years. Now, that's a function of the main effects in the vector X and the interaction effects in the vector Z. And then we've also included fixed effects or cohort effects in W. And that's just to capture changes in the skill distribution of incoming cohorts over time, right? So the students, on average, their test scores may have gotten better. They may have come from higher or lower income households over time. The inclusion of the vector W will actually remove those from the analysis. And so here we have the results. These are sort of the raw results from estimating our equation. So here we have our main effects: Black, Hispanic, American Indian, Asian, low income, and male, right? Those are, if we just wanted to assume that these are potential sources of discrimination in higher education that are independent of one another, then we would stop there. But you can see below male, we include all potential interaction effects between the main effects here. Now to note, so we see, if we look at our main effects, right, we see the effect of being Black in our data. It says that you have a, everything else held equal, that ceteris paribus interpretation, is that being Black results in almost a 23% lower likelihood of graduating within 6 years compared to students that do not identify as Black, holding everything else constant. And then we see there's actually no statistically significant for the main effect on Hispanic, and there is a smaller but still statistically significant negative impact for students that identify as American Indian. And then what we do from here after looking at the main effects is that we want to look at some interactive effects just to see what the other sources of potential discrimination in this model are. And so we can see that there is separate statistically significant effects for being both Black and low income in the data, and also being American Indian and low income. And so, for example, if I was a respondent in the study who identified as Black and I was in this low income category, then adding my marginal effects for Black and low income, and then Black times low income, adding those all together and finding the appropriate standard error would give the predicted likelihood of graduating within 6 years for my particular social location, right? It's that adding up of coefficients that's important when we move to the next step. Other things to mention on the slide. So we have this likelihood ratio stat and residual interclass correlation. And so this indicates that I've included some sort of hierarchical component. As I'd mentioned, in this model, we allow for correlated outcomes for students that come from the same feeder high school, which seems intuitive. They are taught by the same set of teachers in the same geographic location with the same budgetary issues and same local cultural factors affecting both students, or affecting all students from that particular feeder high school. What this likelihood ratio statistic tells us, and the stat is sufficiently large to tell us that results are statistically different when we accommodate this natural clustering of students from feeder high schools. However, if you look at the intraclass correlation coefficient of 0.026, right, this is a correlation, so this correlation will range from 0 to 1. This is quite low. And one way of thinking about this in hierarchical linear models is that this 0.026, that represents the correlation in the outcome if you were to randomly draw two students from the same feeder high school in our context. So yes, there's a statistically significant correlation within the feeder high school. Yes, it results in an improvement over a model that ignores this natural clustering, but the magnitude of the correlation is relatively low. And so this is part 2 of our regression approach. Right now we've taken all of the appropriate linear combinations of the various estimated coefficients, and we've used the delta method to calculate their standard errors. And so what we have white high-income women as our base category. In this case, we chose this base category just because this is a social location that tends to fare very well in American higher education. White high-income women, on average, tend to fare even better than white high-income men, as many of us know that study higher ed. So this becomes our baseline category, right? Our baseline social location. And I'll just mention before I forget, is that every time we've submitted one of these quantitative intersectionality kind of regression-based papers to a journal, we always get referees coming back and asking why. Why did you choose that baseline? And our response is always the same. It's arbitrary. We could have picked low-income Hispanic men as the base. It really doesn't matter. My thought on this particular choice was because this group, white high-income women fare well. Then if we're comparing all of our other social locations to this baseline, all of the signs are essentially going to be negative. And so just with the naked eye, it's easier to make comparisons by choosing this particular base category. But in reality, it's completely arbitrary. So just to pick out a couple of coefficients and to interpret them, excuse me, I need my coffee this early for me. So if we look at, for example, we'll move down to kind of the third block of social locations for students that identify as Hispanic. So if we look at Hispanic high-income women, the marginal effect is negative 0.033 or negative 3.3%. However, the standard error is quite large relative to the coefficient, so this is not statistically different from 0. So what this model finds out, or what this model suggests, is that the likelihood of graduating from this particular university within 6 years is not different between white high-income women and Hispanic high-income women. However, if we look at some of the other social locations with individuals identifying as Hispanic, we can look at Hispanic low-income women. And we see the marginal effect here is negative 22.5%, statistically significant at the 1% level, right? So this is a very meaningful result in our model, and it says that compared to the baseline, compared to white high-income women, low-income Hispanic women are over 20% less likely to graduate within 6 years. And if we keep moving down the line, we can see that actually the largest graduation penalty comes for low-income Hispanic men, who are 24% less likely to graduate within 6 years compared to white high-income women, our baseline group. One thing that's important to note with this sort of output is just to note the cell size, right? And as you can see, even with almost 6,500 observations, we still have some cells which are relatively small. And this just reflects the demographics of the institution. For example, our smallest cell size is for high-income Black men. Now, if we were to go back to the descriptive statistics, you can see the percentage of students at this R1 university that identify as Black is actually quite low, right? It's in the single digits in terms of percentages. So it's not necessarily surprising that we have these low cell sizes. But one thing I will mention in relation to cell sizes, even though we just have 18 students that fall into the social location, you have to think that we're comparing them to a much broader group of students. So even though the cell size is small and it's under 35-ish, we're still able to do hypothesis testing in this case. But where this really becomes problematic is where cell sizes get into single digits or end up being 0, which can cause some trouble for estimating the model. So yeah, this is the all-important step 2 of this regression-based approach. These are the main tables that we present when we're looking at different outcomes. And we developed this method just to make it a clean, relatively easy glance, right? Read for the audience if they want to look at specific social locations and see how they compare. And also, before I move on, it's also worth mentioning that, yes, all of these marginal effects, it compares one social location to a chosen baseline location. But because we all have the same baseline or same reference group, we're also able to compare, for example, high-income Asian women to American Indian high-income women, right? Because we have the same baseline, we can compare our coefficients. So not only do we get a look at how we fare compared to the chosen baseline category, but we can look and compare within other social locations that are not chosen as the baseline. So it becomes a very powerful way of visualizing or understanding the sometimes nuanced and often very complex landscape of discrimination in various contexts. So in this case, we're looking at the likelihood of being placed in a developmental or remedial English course by race, ethnicity, gender, and class. So again, these are the raw coefficients. We haven't added our coefficients together to arrive at the estimates for different social locations. But that will be our next step. But it's important to note that all of our main effects, the effects on Black, Hispanic, American Indian, Asian, low income, those are all highly statistically significant, right, at the 1% level. However, the marginal effect for male is not statistically different from 0. So in this model, just looking at gender, looking at male versus female, there's no statistically meaningful differences between remedial placement rates in English across men and women in this model. But looking down at our interaction effects like we had before, we see that there's an additional penalty or a higher likelihood for identifying as both Hispanic and low income. Being in that overlapping group increases the likelihood of you being placed in remedial English at this institution by 6.5%. We also see statistically significant interaction effects for the intersection of American Indian and low income and Asian and low income. And if we look further down the table, we see a specific interaction effect for being simultaneously identifying as American Indian, low income, and male. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was frozen for a second there. So now we're looking again, we're still looking at remedial English placement, but now we've added our marginal effects appropriately to get it overall estimates for each social location. So because this is a talk on HSIs, let's move down to the Hispanic social locations. So we see compared to the baseline, high income Hispanic women are 14.2% more likely to be placed in a remedial English course upon matriculation at this particular university. The effects, the likelihood of being placed in remedial English is much larger, actually, for low-income Hispanic men, who are over 30% more likely to be placed in remedial English course. And not far behind in terms of placement in these remedial courses would be low-income Hispanic women, who are just under 30% more likely to be placed in remedial English at this particular university. So for time's sake, I'm going to move a little bit quicker through this. Oh, I'm sorry. We're concluding the 2018 race, ethnicity, education paper. So our main findings is that assuming that race, ethnicity, gender, and class are independent is an oversimplification, right? When we allow these different individual characteristics to be interdependent on one another, to interact with one another according to the tenets of critical race theory and intersectionality, we find a much more holistic and richer picture of discrimination in higher education. And so what we see is that we have main effects that have their measurable, statistically meaningful effects on success in college, but we also see the interaction effects having statistically meaningful contributions to discrimination in this context. So the fact that we're seeing statistical significance in both the main and interaction effects is strong evidence that these characteristics are interdependent on one another and should be modeled as such. And so this paper was really the start of what we're trying to develop as sort of a new approach for assessing the complex nature of inequality in various contexts, not just higher education, but this could be health, the labor market. It could be, so many contexts. We could talk about that ad infinitum. So the second paper, which is a work in progress, uses administrative data from two research universities, two HSIs, an R1 and an R2, within the same state in the American Southwest. Here, our focus is a bit different. So again, we're focusing on graduation, and we're focusing on, developmental English placement. But here on the right-hand side, we're going to be looking at first-generation status, right? Individuals who are the first in their family to attend an institute of higher education. And again, the methods are the same. We're using this mouthful of a term, saturated mixed effects logistic models, but here we're including university fixed effects and cohort effects just to tease out a little more heterogeneity and account for differences between these two universities, because although these universities are in the same state, and they're both HSIs, they're both research universities, they're in different geographic locations, and they attract different students. There's a different culture at each of these universities, and so accounting for that when we're trying to estimate discrimination in higher education is paramount, right? It's absolutely key. And I'll talk about that more once I start getting into results. Our research questions are really the same, but what we're focusing on in terms of intersectionality is a bit different. So again, we're looking at what's the value added in assuming that these characteristics such as first generation college, race, ethnicity, gender, when we treat them as independent versus interdependent, what's the gain? How does that change the picture of discrimination in higher education? And so we have these kind of silly names for the two universities just in order to protect their identities. So we can see at Southwestern Public University, I'll just call it SPU, versus Borderlands University, BU. There are quite a bit of differences across these two institutions, right? There are more first-gen students attending Borderlands University. Graduation rates also tend to be lower at BU compared to SPU. They have different policies on who is required to take a developmental course in mathematics or English, which is why we see quite different rates of assignment to these remedial courses across these two universities. In terms of the percent identifying as Hispanic, it's a bit higher in Borderlands University, and that is a statistically significant difference, as indicated by the asterisks in column number 3. And so here we're looking at the likelihood of completing college within 4 years. And 4 years is sort of a strange time frame, right? This is a time frame we used to look at decades ago when time to degree was more averaging around 4 years. Nowadays, we look at 150% of, quote, normal time. So we generally look at 6-year or even sometimes 8-year graduation rates. But because these data are grabbing cohorts that are relatively new entrants into these institutions, at this point, we were only able to go out to 4-year graduation rates. However, as I mentioned before, this is a work in progress, and we have additional years of information now. So these results have changed, since we first estimated them. But what we see here, and this is sort of curious, is that we see the main effects being strong sources of discrimination in higher education in these models, right? Being male makes you 2.4% less likely to graduate within 4 years from either one of these universities. There's a negative effect for being a first-generation college student, and a negative effect for identifying as Hispanic or American Indian, and also for identifying as Black in these models. However, if you notice, there's very little evidence, very little statistical significance when we're looking at the interaction effects. And so what this tells us is that the main effects are what's really going to be driving the differences between social locations. For example, if we look at individuals that are both identify as male and American Indian, they're actually 3.5% more likely to graduate within 4 years. And so there is some evidence of interdependence among the main effects, but not as drastic, not as sort of upfront compared to the results that we saw with that race, ethnicity, and education paper that we just reviewed. And so here, after taking the appropriate linear combinations, we've chosen continuing generation white women as the reference group. And so, for example, if we go down a few lines, we can look at those that identify as Hispanic. So we see that continuing generation Hispanic women are 1.3% less likely to graduate in 4 years compared to continuing generation white women. And then we have effects of a similar size, but a little bit larger penalties for those that identify as continuing generation Hispanic men or first generation Hispanic men. And just note that these effects by social location, these are quite small, but it's also important to put these in context. If we went back to the descriptive statistics, the likelihood of graduating within 4 years at either SPU or BU, the two universities in our sample, is actually quite low, right? It's not more than 20%. So when you're talking about a 3.5 or a 4% penalty, that's actually of a decent size given the low baseline rate of 4-year graduation rates. And so here we're looking again at remedial placement in an English course. And we're seeing the same similar pattern that we saw with graduation rates. In this particular data set, we see strong main effects, right, for being first gen, Hispanic, American Indian, Black, Asian. However, when it comes to the interaction effects, we see little evidence. And so here, again, we're in step 2, we're looking at remedial English placement. So compared to the reference group, compared to continuing generation white women, we see that first generation Hispanic men are 7.2 percentage points more likely than the baseline group to be assigned to a remedial English course. All right, for first generation Hispanic women, this is this increased likelihood is 8.3% relative to the baseline. And if your eye can sort of quickly scan and pick out sort of the group that's most likely to be assigned to these remedial courses relative to the baseline group, and that would be first generation Black men, who are over 15% more likely to be required to take a remedial English course upon matriculation at these 2 universities. So just wrapping up this 2023, this in progress working paper, we find evidence of some nuanced inequities in higher education, just looking at first gen status, gender, and this composite race ethnicity measure that we have from these data. But we see that differences across social locations are mostly driven by main effects. And so this limited statistical significance of these interaction terms provides weak evidence of interdependence between race, ethnicity, gender, and first gen status. It's there, and the model's improved by allowing for this interdependence across these different individual characteristics, but it's not as this interdependence is not as pronounced as it was in the first paper, where most of our interaction effects were large in magnitude and highly statistically significant. So just thinking about moving forward, I think that we're in the early days of these sorts of regression-based studies of intersectionality. And so there's a lot of room to grow. And perhaps, as is usually one of the main things talking about future research, is more data, better data, more collaboration. But really, it's absolutely true. If we could have more HSIs collaborating and sharing administrative data, we would increase our sample size. We would avoid having these really small cell sizes that can be problematic for these types of models, and it would improve the external validity of our studies. Right? We started with one R1 medium-sized research university, an HSI in the American Southwest. Now we've moved on to 2 within the same state, both research institutions, both HSIs. But any journal referee or any critical eye on one of these journal articles or one of these manuscripts that we're putting together would say, well, can we generalize? Is this the HSI experience, or is this something that's unique to this particular state in the union, right? And so if we could have more collaboration and more data sharing across different states, right, across more institutions, then the likelihood that these results can be generalized to the broader HSI experience is improved. And so that's why collaboration is really going to be key for future research using these models. Also, and this is something that Nancy actually talked about when she was introducing the session, the data collection upon matriculation is key, right? How do we treat identifying as Hispanic? Are we going to continue to treat it as a race in the way that we collect data? Because that really hampers our understanding of intersectionality moving forward. So properly collecting the data at matriculation is key. One thing that we've dealt with when we try to control for socioeconomic status using FAFSA, right? FAFSA is not required in many contexts, and so we find that higher income students are less likely to fill out a FAFSA or file a FAFSA, and so this can result in certain types of biases in our results. So it's important that we try to get sort of uniform measures of socioeconomic status And whether this be from the FAFSA being mandated, or whether this comes from mandatory student surveys upon entry, these are different options for trying to avoid biases from non-reporting, essentially. Also, something that you don't pick up in administrative data, but something that is likely to continue to be an increasing focus would be the LGBTQIA community moving forward. Even having optional questions on some sort of mandatory, survey upon matriculation would allow us to incorporate those individual characteristics in our studies of intersectionality, which I think is something that's frankly missing from the discussion in large part at this moment. And also thoughts on future research. With these sorts of models, I think really the sky is the limit. As an economist, I could study, tax burden based on race, ethnicity, gender and income, or, if I was a health researcher, I might look at, likelihood of being, of having a child put in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, based on race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, or, various things. So really picking up these methods and using them wherever there's an interesting and important data question or policy question is really one of the brightest spots in this area of research, right? I think it has tremendous potential moving forward. So that'll conclude my talk for today. As I mentioned, if you took nothing else out of this rather kind of technical exposition that I've laid out, is that when we're using regression to operationalize ideas or tenets of intersectionality and critical race theory, it's absolutely key that we not treat them, as we've been doing for decades, not treating individual characteristics such as these as independent, but rather allowing for them to be interdependent in any sort of quantitative research. And so with that, I will conclude. Thank you for listening and looking forward to our discussion.